Welcome to the Russia on the Record podcast. This episode we focus on the latest events in Nagorno-Karabakh and Russia's role in the crisis. For decades, Russia was perceived as a mediator in resolving or at least freezing the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Following the latest escalation and the announcement of the abolition of Nagorno-Karabakh, a wave of dissatisfaction with Russia's actions has swept through Armenia, and Russian-Armenian relations appear to have reached the most tense point in their history. How could this conflict play out in the future, and how does this change Russia's role in the region? Caucasus expert Kirill Krivosheev and journalist Tom Bennett join us today to discuss. Before attacking Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan blocked the Lachin corridor for many months. Did you expect this latest escalation that just took place? Kirill, probably you will start.
Thank you. Really, I didn't believe that this very radical scenario could become truth, because I just thought that Azerbaijan bluffs and flexes its muscles to push Armenia towards some new compromise at the negotiation table. And we should notice that just a day before the rockets flew to Stepanakert and before so many people died, both Agdam and Lachin roads were unblocked after this months of blockade. Humanitarian aid really flowed into the region, and people received it. And just the day after, they suffered a lot. So I expected that all this was going to be just the bluff of Azerbaijan, and it is just the card at the negotiation table, because it was hard to believe that Russian peacekeepers deployed there totally lost the image of a moderator who could handle with both sides and keep the situation stable, because just for the last 2 years, we didn't see harsh problems in Nagorno-Karabakh and all the clashes that really happened. They happened at the internationally recognized border between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So I said I believed it is not going to happen, but I was really sadly mistaken.
What about you, Tom? You're on the ground. Did you expect something like this could happen?
I would agree that it wasn't necessarily expected that it would take place in this way. Azerbaijan just shelling Stepanakert in the middle of the day. But I think anyone that's been watching this conflict for the past few years kind of expected that something like this was bound to happen. When the 2020 war ended, it ended in a peace deal brokered by Russia, and that left just one part of Nagorno-Karabakh under the Artsakh government's control, whereas all the surrounding districts became under Azerbaijani control. So this meant that Artsakh remained connected to Armenia via just this one singular road, the Lachin corridor, literally just one road that was guarded by Russian peacekeepers under the agreements of the deal. Now, any outside observer can see that this is not a sustainable situation. And when Azerbaijan decided to blockade that road and stop goods, food, fuel, medical supplies coming to and from Nagorno-Karabakh, I think it became pretty obvious that Azerbaijan had ambitions to complete their victory. In Azerbaijan at the time of the 2020 agreement, this was termed an incomplete victory, which kind of tells you how close they thought they were and how satisfied they were with their results from that iteration of the conflict. So, yeah, I think it is debatably a surprise that it happened so suddenly, that it happened just in the middle of the day. They started shelling, and within 24 hours, they'd taken it. But I don't think the actual outcome of Nagorno-Karabakh returning to Azerbaijani control is much of a surprise for most people that have been monitoring this.
So you mentioned that Russian peacekeepers didn't intervene. What was happening? So what versions do you know why that happened? I mean, why they didn't intervene? Kirill?
I think that Russian peacekeepers just behaved the same way every time when Azeri forces stepped up since 2020. First time it happened near Gadjut in December 2020, then near Faruch village in March 2022. Actually, this Russian mission wasn't peacekeepers. They were actually more monitors and maybe humanitarian mission. And I believe that their peacekeepers' mandate was based on the Russian image and Russia's moral authority in the region. But since February 2022, since the war in Ukraine started, this moral image was lost by Russia, and therefore Baku and Azerbaijan authorities, they demonstrated more and more frankly that Russia is not considered as the referee. And so they have no real responsibility and no real mandate for any activities and for actions in this region. So really, the influence of Russian peacekeepers since 2022 slided, and so they really become just the monitors, rightless monitors. So that wasn't really surprising that they failed to do something when the offensive started.
Yeah, so since the war in Ukraine started, Russia has found itself more and more isolated on the world stage, and they've become more reliant on partners like Turkey and Azerbaijan, who've become more strategically important for them. So in their eyes, it's more important for them to build relationships with partners like Azerbaijan than it is to maintain those relationships with Armenia.
Yeah, do you agree, Kirill, that Russia sacrificed Armenia because of its need to build closer ties with Turkey and Azerbaijan because of the sanctions passed over the war in Ukraine?
Partly yes, but not fully, because there is another reason for Russia to behave like this. Russia tries to hide its diplomatic failure because it was a big diplomatic failure that Russian peacekeepers didn't have any mandate for actions, as I mentioned. So they had a lot of guns, but they had no right to use it. That was really funny because if you have tanks and a lot of military weapons, helicopters, but when something happened, you just watching and just preparing your report to the Moscow. What's the reason for you to keep this helicopter on the ground? And I think that Baku pressed on Moscow in 2020. Baku acted really smart to prepare this kind of treaty that was signed on the 9th of November 2020. So Russian peacekeepers were really rightless, as I mentioned. And yes, now Russia very much depend on Turkey and Azerbaijan. So Moscow afraid of being isolated by them as well as a lot of other Western countries. Or how should I call it? It's the great diplomatic failure, a great diplomatic mistake. But to hide it, it is much better to blame Nikol Pashinyan that he is guilty because he recognized the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan just a year ago in Prague. So it's a very easy way to lift our own responsibility for what happened in the region. And now Russia propaganda blames Pashinyan in everything what happened. So I don't believe that it is correct to do so. But it's propaganda, so they behave like this.
You mentioned that Russian propaganda presents Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan as the main culprit of what happened, as the main reason for this conflict. Are there many supporters of this position in Armenia? Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think the feelings towards Pashinyan are very mixed here. Some people feel he's a traitor. They feel that he kind of let down people of Nagorno-Karabakh by not sending in the military to defend them. But other people kind of recognize that he's in an incredibly difficult position. If Pashinyan had sent the military there to defend Nagorno-Karabakh, it could have escalated the situation more and actually left Armenia in a much more difficult position. So Armenia really is very isolated, and Pashinyan finds himself in a very difficult spot. And I think that's reflected in some of the protests that we've seen here. They seem to have died down somewhat now, but initially there was a kind of mixed, different sides to the protesters. Some of them kind of were more supportive of Pashinyan, some of them wanted to get rid of him. It was a kind of confusing situation. And yeah, I think that's emblematic of how difficult Armenia's problems are right now.
And what are the current sentiments in Armenia regarding Russian peacekeepers and Russia in general? And how have they changed since 2020, the previous war in Nagorno-Karabakh?
So the people that I spoke to in Goris, who had just fled from Nagorno-Karabakh, some of them were incredibly angry at the lack of action from the peacekeepers. Some of them felt they'd been abandoned. They felt that the peacekeepers had just stood by and let the Azerbaijanis take their land. They felt that they had, not carried out the promises that they'd made to kind of protect the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. But they didn't just feel let down by the Russian peacekeepers, they felt let down by the international community. So it wasn't just the Russians who didn't kind of get involved here. No one got involved to stop this situation happening. I think it makes it quite a complex situation in that way. But on the flip side of it, some of the people fleeing Nagorno-Karabakh were actually very grateful, because what actually happened on the ground was many of the peacekeepers actually helped people evacuate from their villages and from their towns and make it safely to the Russian base, which, thousands of them ended up waiting out for a period before they eventually managed to flee to Armenia. Some of them were saying things like, if it hadn't been for the Russians, we would have been murdered. As someone said, we were expecting the Azeris to kill us. Now, whether that is kind of exaggerated or not is another question, but certainly they felt great fear, and they did feel very grateful for the fact that the peacekeepers did evacuate them for safety. So overall, it was a kind of mixed picture. And ultimately, these people have just come from an incredibly traumatic situation. They arrived in Armenia without most of their possessions. Some of them had literally nothing. They came with just the clothes that they were wearing. They'd fled straight from their homes. So, a lot of these people, they're not thinking about geopolitics. They're not thinking about allies and international partners. They're just thinking about where they're going to sleep the next day. So we'll kind of slowly see over the next few weeks how things develop, and potentially how opinion develops within Armenia on the views towards Russia.
You mentioned that Armenians feel abandoned in this conflict. And which countries or organizations do Armenian politicians and ordinary people now call as their allies abroad? Are there any?
I read that a lot of Western countries like USA, France, Norway, Germany, and even Iran, they sent a lot of humanitarian aid to Armenia now. But actually, when the evacuation was going on, Russian peacekeepers also brought some humanitarian aid, particular to Nagorno-Karabakh, and so they supplied these people with oil because, after the months of blockade, there were no oil in the region, so you couldn't fuel your car just to escape. We know that the great tragedy took place just at the outskirts of Stepanakert. The big tank of this oil exploded, and I should notice that it is the second biggest tragedy since this conflict started in the perestroika times at 1988. The first one was the Hadjali tragedy, when the massacre of Azeri people with Armenian soldiers. And the second one is this. So just days ago, when this tank exploded, 70 people died just almost in a day. So about the humanitarian aid, I believe that the Western countries would try to continue doing this just to support Armenia and just to make Armenians believe that they are much better as allies than Russia. But Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that Russia fully supports the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, but really now Russia has big problems with the government of Armenia, sadly. So that happened, and I think that maybe some organizations in Russia would try to help particularly Armenians of Karabakh, and they do. So I think that's it.
Tom, you're now in Armenia, and you saw lots of refugees that have arrived there since the end of September. How is humanitarian aid being organized for them? There are many international organizations and aid from other countries arriving.
I would actually say that the aid effort seems to have been organised fairly well. In the town centre of Goris, which was kind of one of the main reception facilities for the refugees that came through, there was the Red Cross World Food Programme. There's been various donations from countries. I think the UK gave £1 million to the ICRC. Samantha Power, who's head of USAID, visited shortly after September 19th. And, the flow of refugees from Goris or out of Nagorno-Karabakh and into Armenia seems to have been fairly smooth. It was quite chaotic during the first few days, but we have to remember 100,000 people have fled into Armenia, which is a huge number. And they seem to now have dispersed throughout the country and not just stuck in this one town, which they were for the first day or two.
There are many Russian immigrants in Armenia who moved there in February 2022 and later. Have you noticed any change in attitude towards them since the Azerbaijani attack in Nagorno-Karabakh? Kirill, do you have any idea about it?
Yeah, sure. I could say that the number of Russians who fled to Armenia last year is quite equal to the number of Armenians who fled from Nagorno-Karabakh region, and 100,000 persons. Yeah, and yes, these people are very, very different. Like Russian people who fled to Armenia, they usually some kind of IT workers, so they earn their money abroad and they just spend them in Armenia, and they are not fully integrated in the economic system of Armenia. A lot of my friends who fled to Armenia, they did not even know about this conflict last year. And it was rather funny when in the chats created by Russian immigrants, there were questions like, so guys, where the bus to Baku goes from? So maybe I'm gonna just spend my weekend at Baku. Yeah. And now they learned a lot about this. So a lot of them were really shocked. So for sure, they compare this conflict with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but this is not correct. So as an expert in this region, I could say that it's completely different conflicts. But anyway, I can say that Russian immigrants are very much involved in this humanitarian projects. So they really gain the humanitarian aid in some centers. And they are really empathic to the new homeland, the country that is so much hospitable to them. And really, I could say that sometimes they compare Ilham Aliyev to Vladimir Putin. So they compare the situations, but they try to help people. And sometimes it looks really naive. Anyway, I think that every time when people want to help each other, it's good news.
Kirill, you said that many Russians compare this conflict to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and I read also many Armenians do so. You also mentioned that it's not comparable. Why not?
No, because these conflicts took much more time. I mentioned since the end of 80s. So I believe that really the main Armenian argument that Nagorno-Karabakh was never part of independent Azerbaijan. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, this region was de facto independent. So it wasn't controlled by new independent Azeri government. And so even before the Soviet Union collapsed, even before we saw kind of pogroms, the great massacres of Armenian people in Sumgait and Baku. And so it is the great reason for Armenians to be afraid of living in Azerbaijan. Talking about the east of Ukraine and so-called Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who may be, as Russian propaganda said, wasn't treated really good by their Ukrainian authorities. So, first of all, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea lived years under the Ukrainian rule. And so we didn't see any effects of kind of massacres, or the suffering of the population who lived there. So, since the conflict started, the communication between this region, de facto controlled by Russia, and the rest of Ukraine, we had the communications between this, and that was okay. But in fact, young Armenians and Azeri people didn't ever communicate to each other. So they never met each other, and that's the great problem for them to establish any, as diplomats said, measures of trust. How to build any measures of trust if you never talk to these people? So these conflicts are very, very different. This Armenian-Azeri conflict is more about the ethnic hatred, and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is more about political views. So yes, people in Donetsk and people in Kiev, people in Lviv and Crimea, they have quite different political views and their views about their future. And yes, a lot of people maybe support Russia even there, but it is not about ethnic hatred. Ethnic hatred is a much worse thing, as I suppose.
Yeah, on January 1st, the separatist Nagorno-Karabakh Republic will formally cease to exist. What do you see for the future of this region?
So right now, Stepanakert, the biggest city in Nagorno-Karabakh, is basically a ghost town. The UN visited this week and said that there's between 50 to 1,000 people left living there. Now, for comparison, in 2021, the population was around 75,000. So that just demonstrates the kind of exodus that has taken place from Stepanakert and from Nagorno-Karabakh in general. As for what happens next, I think we'll see over the next few weeks. Azerbaijan has said kind of repeatedly that it will protect the rights of the Armenians if they want to return. But the vast majority of the people who have left don't believe that. They don't believe that Azerbaijan will respect their rights. As Kirill said, this is an ethnic conflict and it's been going on for 30 years now, on and off. So most of the people have lived through previous iterations of this conflict. And at times it's been extremely violent, extremely bloody. I think there's a lot of trauma there for the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh who, it seems, don't want to return. So we'll see over the next few weeks and months and possibly years over what the future of the region is.
Yeah, actually, I believe that the 1st January is a very formal date. It means actually nothing because this republic does not agree just today, just already. And so the so-called reintegration process started by Azerbaijan, I don't believe it to be sincere, because if it was sincere, I think that Azerbaijani government would rather create some kind of platform for registration of Armenian people just years ago. But they actually created this on 28th of September, just some days ago. And now they published their so-called reintegration plan. But anyway, I believe it's too late. During the last year, I repeatedly asked my interlocutors in Baku about the integration plan. So what you going to do with these people? What you going to promise them? How are you going to deserve their trust, their credibility? Why should they believe you? Anyway, they answered nothing, and now we see this plan, but that's just a joke. Baku said that 7 Armenians, they applied for the citizenship, but 7 people compared to the whole population. It's a really funny thing. So we couldn't confirm it, we couldn't verify it. We saw the photo of some elderly guys. They may be Armenian, but we should find some friends of them who fled to Armenia to recognize them, to know what's their names, just to figure it out whether it's true or not. But anyway, 7 people is not serious. It is not some kind of game changer. And aftermath, I don't believe that anything could change. What the good thing I could say about Baku, I think that the good thing that not so few people were arrested when evacuated from Nagorno-Karabakh via Lachin corridor. We could see that arrest, it is the measure for VIP persons only. So for VIP, some kind of military commanders or officials who try to flee, like Russian businessman and investor Ruben Vardanyan, but many others, people who really served in the army, for example, who took part in the war, really, because among these 100,000 people, I'm quite sure that there was a lot of people who actually took part in the wars that was going on since the collapse of Soviet Union in this region. But they were able to flee. Unfortunately, we just today received the news that 3 former presidents of the self-proclaimed republic, they are arrested and transported to Baku. So I think that we should expect a very pompous court for them that will be aired in all their state-run TV channels. So it's kind of like that. So almost all of the people fled from the region, but it is possible to justify themselves for Baku, or that not everyone, and there are a few people who believed us and who are ready to live with us. So therefore, this whole process couldn't be named as ethnic cleansing, like Armenian side tried to claim it. But we're gonna see the absorbing of Armenian application for the International Court of United Nations. So we'll see what's going to happen then.
Is there a risk of this conflict escalating in the near future, or does Armenia have nothing to respond to Azerbaijan, and the international community will most likely prefer not to interfere in the conflict?
So I believe that, there is kind of threat for Sunni region. And so I think that there will be the big diplomatic clash about this, about the fate of this so-called Zangezur corridor. And you know that now this summer in Baku, there are kind of people organization like West Azerbaijan Refugee Organization was created. And other people who fled from Armenian regions in the end of Soviet Union. And Baku now claims that people should be returned to their homes after 30 years of being somewhere. But actually, I now couldn't believe in full-scale invasion of Azerbaijan to Armenia because Mr. Aliyev, I believe, doesn't want to be compared with Putin. So doing this in the eyes of the Western countries, these two politicians will be the same. And you know that Aliyev's main goal to continue oil and gas supplying to Europe. And so he's going to expand these supplements and to build new gas tube to Italy. So it is not a good thing to occupy some territories, but actually the road, this corridor is a really critical thing for Azerbaijan and Turkey. And as we now see Armenia in such a weak position, I think that something will happen and they maybe agree on the plan that will be very comfortable for Baku and Ankara. But it may be the last thing where Russia could play its role, because according to the treaty of 2020, Russia's bodyguards should control this route. And we should notice that Russian bodyguards still control their Armenian borders with Turkey and with Iran since early 90s. So if Russia's diplomacy, if Russia's bodyguard would do something, maybe Armenian positions will be a little bit protected, a little bit better than without this factor.
I would just add that I've just come from Goris, which is in Syunik province, and the atmosphere on the ground there amongst people is definitely one of kind of fear about the future in terms of, could Azerbaijan try and build this corridor that Kirill mentions, and the impacts that could have on them is certainly something that they're fearful of, and it's certainly in the front of people's minds in that area.
Yeah, Kirill, you said you think that there is no interest for Azerbaijan, for Aliyev to attack Armenia because it would like to continue to sell gas and oil to Europe. But could we expect invasion in faraway future, like after the conflict in Ukraine ends?
We couldn't create any plans for the so far future because we couldn't build plans even for the next year. But I think that both Azerbaijan and Turkey, they expect to start the economic and political expansion to Armenia. And if Armenia open the border with Turkey, this is going to be the new factor in this region and in Armenian internal policy. So, and if we are going to see the decrease in Russian-Armenian relations, and we do, I believe, they are decreasing now. If Turkey will take more power in the region, maybe there will no need to occupy something. It will be done with other leverages, with the other tools. Just Armenia will be in Turkey's hands, and economy is a much better and much powerful factor than weapon.
Yeah, we already discussed that Russia lost its credibility, its position in South Caucasus. But could you sum up what just everything that happened mean for Russia and its role in the South Caucasus?
I think that handling this conflict, Russia tried to create the relations with either Armenia or Azerbaijan like they are with Georgia. Georgia is the worst example in terms of relations with Russia in this region. Anyway, I'm afraid that now Armenia is turning to second Georgia. If we spoil the relation with this nation, and this nation some years ago, they were fully pro-Russian, not pro-Putin maybe, but pro-Russian actually. The great mistake to lose some kind of allies. Yes, they were poor, they were not very powerful, but these people, they loved us and they relied on us. So I think that even relying on Azerbaijan is not the best idea, because they now in the stronger position and they would push to Armenia and to Georgia just to get what they want. So they very much backed by Turkey. And yes, just this May, everything could change the track if Mr. Erdogan lost the elections, but we know that it wasn't like this. He, in fact, won this. So we could see the great increase of Turkish influence in the region and decrease of the Russian one. And in these conditions, the situation in Armenia could become worse. There could be the political turbulence, because we know that Pashinyan is not popular actually, but there is no other politician who could replace him, because unfortunately every politician that could be in charge today in Armenia will be obliged to do these very unpopular steps. So I think that it's kind of fatalism.
Yeah, like Russia has kind of pivoted slightly more towards Azerbaijan in this moment. It's kind of shifted its focus away from Armenia, and it's slightly more amenable towards Azerbaijan. One of the reasons that I've heard on that is Russia recently brokered an agreement for a railway to run between Russia and Iran. Now, Iran is obviously quite an important strategic partner for Russia at this moment. It's supplied Russia with arms for its war in Ukraine, and that railway will run through Azerbaijan. So that's kind of one of the reasons, perhaps, that we've seen Russia kind of take a slightly new strategy in that area. So yeah, I think it's kind of, we might see Turkey having more influence along with Azerbaijan, and Russia's kind of now starting to work with those partners rather than being a more dominating force in the region.
There is kind of agreeing about was it ethnic cleansing or not. But what I should add that really this kind of voluntarily moving as Azerbaijani side, so it was because of the great fear in the face of being part of Azerbaijan for these people. And really Azerbaijan failed to do anything to make these people believe Baku. And I think it wasn't sincere willingness for Baku to make these people stay. And now they just did what was much easier for them, just to push them away and just to reconstruct this area as they want to do. But actually, I don't think that it would be easy, because we know that the territory that was liberated, as Baku said, is really big, and there are a lot of minefields there. And we saw that even the territory that was liberated or recaptured, as you wish, in 2020, it is not resettled yet. Even there is the kind of plan, great resettlement by Baku. So until 2027, only about 150,000 people should live there. So how could we believe that millions of people would move to this area, which is totally devastating with the war? Yes, this is totally collapsed and ruined. And I think that Azeri people would see the big examples of corruption in this region, because we don't know whom these territories and whom these lands, whose property is going to be. So, and in this situation, it is a very typical situation for the big corruption schemes. But now it could turn to some kind of disappointment, because we don't know whether this victory would bring them happiness.